What if I told you that King Henry VIII was so committed to being a disaster that even his corpse managed to cause absolute mayhem? Picture this: the most notorious monarch in English history, finally dead after terrorizing his kingdom for decades, and his body literally explodes inside his own coffin. We're talking about a king whose flesh burst through his lead-lined casket while he was lying in state, creating such a horrific scene that it spawned legends lasting centuries. This isn't some medieval fairy tale or dramatic exaggeration for Hollywood. Palace records and historical accounts describe Henry VIII's post-mortem spectacle in visceral detail. The man who executed 2 wives, broke with Rome, and left England drowning in religious chaos couldn't even manage to decompose with dignity. His oversized body, bloated from years of gluttony and disease, reportedly ruptured inside Windsor Castle, forcing servants to deal with what one chronicler delicately called the most ungodly stench ever to assault human senses. But here's where it gets truly insane. The burst coffin wasn't just a gross footnote in history books. It became the foundation for centuries of supernatural speculation. Courtiers whispered that Henry's corpse had been rejected by the earth itself, that even death couldn't contain the evil he'd unleashed during his reign. Some claimed his body exploded as divine punishment for executing Anne Boleyn, while others insisted it was God's verdict on a king who'd declared himself head of the English church. The reality was far more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. Henry VIII had spent his final years as a walking medical catastrophe. We're talking about a man whose legs were covered in festering wounds that never healed, whose body had ballooned to over 300 pounds, and whose internal organs were essentially rotting while he was still alive. When he finally died in 1547, his corpse was so toxic that the decomposition process created gases powerful enough to rupture a lead coffin designed to last for centuries. Historical accounts describe servants discovering fluid seeping from Henry's casket, accompanied by a smell so overwhelming that grown men fled the room gagging. The king's body had literally burst its bonds, creating what contemporary witnesses called a scene from the depths of hell itself. This wasn't just decomposition. This was a corpse so corrupted by disease and excess that it defied every attempt at preservation the Tudor court could devise. Modern medical experts believe Henry's explosive post-mortem condition resulted from multiple factors working together. His massive obesity, combined with what were likely severe infections from his leg ulcers, created the perfect conditions for rapid, violent decomposition. Add the sealed environment of a lead coffin, and you've got a recipe for what essentially amounted to a biological time bomb. But wait, it gets worse. The burst coffin incident wasn't just disturbing for the people who witnessed it. It fundamentally changed how Henry VIII was remembered by history. The man who'd terrorized Europe for nearly 4 decades became known as much for his corpse's behavior as his living tyranny. His death spawned folklore, medical speculation, and religious interpretations that persisted for centuries, turning England's most powerful monarch into a cautionary tale about excess, cruelty, and divine justice. The truth about what happened inside Henry VIII's coffin reveals something far more complex than simple decomposition. It's a story of medical horror, political consequences, and the way death can become its own form of historical judgment. By January 1547, the man who once commanded Europe through sheer force of will couldn't even get out of bed without 3 servants lifting his enormous frame. Henry VIII, the king who had terrorized nobles and wives alike for nearly 4 decades, was dying in the most undignified way possible. Picture this: a monarch who once stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, an athletic giant who could hunt all day and dance all night, now weighed close to 400 pounds and hadn't walked unassisted in years. His legs were so swollen with infected ulcers that the smell of rotting flesh followed him wherever his servants carried him. We're talking about wounds that had been festering for over a decade, oozing pus and blood constantly, never healing. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Those leg ulcers weren't just painful, they were slowly poisoning his entire system. Modern medical experts believe Henry was suffering from chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that was literally eating him alive from the inside. The toxins from his rotting legs were coursing through his bloodstream, affecting his brain, his heart, everything. His courtiers had to pretend everything was normal while their king raged like a wounded animal. Henry would fly into violent fits over the smallest perceived slights, screaming threats of execution at servants who moved too slowly or nobles who dared speak without permission. The man who had already executed 2 wives was becoming even more paranoid and unpredictable as his body consumed itself. The truly insane part. Nobody could even suggest the king was unwell. In Tudor England, speculating about the monarch's death was treason punishable by execution. So while Henry was clearly dying, his entire court had to maintain this elaborate charade that their grotesquely swollen, barely conscious king was perfectly fine. By late January 1547, even Henry couldn't deny what was happening. His physicians finally acknowledged what everyone had whispered about for months, though they were still too terrified to use the word dying. Instead, they spoke in careful euphemisms about the king's great matter of health. Here's something that will blow your mind about Henry's final days. He was so suspicious of being poisoned that he refused most food and medicine, which actually accelerated his death from the very infections he could have treated. This king, who had spent his entire reign eliminating anyone he perceived as a threat, was ultimately destroyed by his own paranoia. On January 27th, Henry finally lost consciousness, but even then, nobody dared tell him he was dying until the very last moment. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned, but by the time he arrived, the king could only squeeze his hand weakly when asked if he trusted in Christ. Henry VIII died at 2 a.m. on January 28th, 1547 at Whitehall Palace. The man who had reshaped England, executed 2 wives, dissolved monasteries, and broken with Rome because he couldn't accept limitations, was defeated by his own rotting body. But here's the thing about Henry's death. It was just the beginning of his body's final act of chaos. What happened next would create legends that lasted for centuries and prove that even in death, Henry VIII couldn't manage to go quietly. The real horror story was about to begin in his coffin. Henry's massive body was sealed inside a lead-lined coffin at Windsor Castle, but what happened next would make even the most hardened undertaker lose sleep. Picture this: a 400-pound corpse packed with rotting organs, wrapped in cloth, then trapped inside an airtight metal box. The royal embalmers thought they'd done their job perfectly. They were catastrophically wrong. Within days of the burial, palace guards at Windsor began reporting something that defied every attempt at royal dignity. A putrid smell was seeping from Henry's tomb, growing stronger each day. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Medieval embalming wasn't the preservation process we know today. They essentially stuffed Henry's body cavity with herbs and spices, wrapped him in expensive cloth, and hoped for the best. The lead coffin that was supposed to preserve the king's body for eternity became a pressure cooker of decomposition. As Henry's organs broke down, they released gases that had nowhere to escape. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other putrid vapors built up inside that sealed metal box, creating mounting pressure that would make a medieval bomb look tame. Contemporary accounts describe what happened next in terms so disturbing they were rarely recorded in official palace records. Charles Wriothesley, a court chronicler, wrote that strange sounds came from the royal tomb, what he described as unnatural creaking and groaning. The smell became so overwhelming that priests conducting services in St. George's Chapel complained they couldn't complete Mass without gagging. But wait, it gets worse. The pressure building inside Henry's coffin was reaching critical levels. His decomposing body was literally expanding, pushing against the lead lining with increasing force. Medieval physics were about to meet royal biology in the most grotesque way possible. Then it happened. Multiple witness accounts suggest that roughly 2 weeks after burial, Henry's coffin essentially exploded from within. The accumulated gases burst through the lead lining with enough force that fluids began seeping from the tomb. We're talking about the liquefied remains of a king, oozing through cracks in what was supposed to be an impenetrable royal resting place. The stench became so unbearable that Windsor Castle had to limit access to the chapel. Palace staff reported that the smell could be detected from corridors away, a putrid mix of rotting flesh and the expensive spices used in embalming that created an almost sweet, sickening odor that clung to everything. What makes this even more disturbing is the medieval belief system surrounding royal burials. Kings were supposed to be blessed by God, their bodies preserved as symbols of divine authority. Yet here was Henry VIII, the man who declared himself head of the English Church, quite literally rotting away in such spectacular fashion that his own tomb couldn't contain him. The palace tried desperately to manage the situation, bringing in additional lead sheeting to reinforce the coffin and seal the leaks. But the damage was done. Henry's body had undergone what modern forensic experts call purge fluid release. Essentially, his decomposing organs had liquefied and found the path of least resistance out of his burial container. This wasn't just royal embarrassment. It was a biological disaster that turned one of England's most powerful monarchs into a medieval horror story. The man who spent his life demanding absolute control couldn't even control his own corpse, creating a gruesome spectacle that would fuel legends for centuries to come. For centuries, people have whispered that Henry VIII's corpse literally exploded inside his coffin, bursting open like some grotesque medieval piñata and splattering the inside of his lead casket with royal remains. The reality is both more mundane and somehow more disturbing than the legend suggests. The explosion myth started with a kernel of truth but grew into something far more dramatic than what actually happened. Medieval and Tudor era understanding of decomposition was limited. So when Henry's body began the natural process of decay, the gases produced caused his corpse to swell dramatically. Think of it this way. A 400-pound man packed into a lead coffin becomes essentially a pressure cooker. The buildup of decomposition gases had nowhere to go. What likely happened was the body distended significantly, possibly causing some rupturing of the skin and release of fluids. But the stories that circulated afterward painted a picture of Henry's corpse detonating like a bomb, covering the inside of his coffin with chunks of the king who had terrorized England for nearly 4 decades. Palace staff, already traumatized by years of serving a murderous tyrant, probably weren't too upset by the poetic justice of it all. Here's where the legends get truly bizarre. Some accounts claim that dogs broke into the burial chamber and lapped up the leaked fluids from Henry's decomposing body. This tale supposedly fulfilled a prophecy that dogs would lick the blood of the tyrant king, echoing the biblical fate of Ahab and Jezebel. Whether this actually happened or was invented by people desperate to see divine retribution against their dead tormentor is unclear, but the story spread like wildfire through Tudor England. The explosion narrative served a deeper psychological need for Henry's traumatized subjects. This was a man who had executed 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of religious dissidents. He had terrorized an entire kingdom for decades. The idea that even in death, his body couldn't find peace, that it literally tore itself apart in the grave, felt like cosmic justice to people who had lived in fear of his wrath. Modern forensic experts believe the reality was probably standard decomposition complications amplified by Henry's massive size and the sealed environment of his lead coffin. Bodies naturally produce gases during decay, and without proper drainage or ventilation, pressure builds up. In someone Henry's size, with his multiple health conditions, this process would have been particularly intense. But here's what makes the Henry VIII coffin legend different from typical decomposition stories. It became a morality tale. Medieval people saw the grotesque state of his remains as proof that God was punishing him even after death. They believed his body's inability to rest peacefully was divine judgment for his cruelty, his break with Rome, and his treatment of his wives. The myths grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed his coffin continued to leak for years, that strange sounds came from his tomb, that his spirit couldn't find rest because his body had been so defiled by his sins in life. These weren't just ghost stories, they were the traumatized population of England processing decades of royal terror through supernatural explanation. Whether Henry's body actually burst, leaked, or simply decomposed normally, the legends reveal something important about how his subjects really felt about their king. They needed to believe that even in death, justice had found him, that his corpse had become as monstrous as the man himself had been in life. Henry's grotesque post-mortem explosion wasn't unique in medieval royal history. It was part of a pattern where powerful rulers met endings that seemed to mock their earthly authority. But here's what makes these deaths truly fascinating. The more power these people wielded in life, the more spectacular their physical destruction became in death. Take Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, whose execution he orchestrated with chilling precision. While Henry's body betrayed him through decay, Anne faced a different kind of physical horror. On May 19, 1536, she knelt on the scaffold at the Tower of London, blindfolded, waiting for the French executioner Henry had specially imported. The choice of sword over axe wasn't mercy. It was theater. Henry wanted her death to be swift and clean, befitting the image of a just king removing a treacherous queen. Medical evidence shows us exactly what happened in that moment. The heavy blade severed Anne's cervical vertebrae, causing immediate traumatic brain injury. Her brain had roughly 30 seconds of potential consciousness as blood pressure dropped catastrophically. Unlike Henry's slow, festering decline, Anne's death was brutally instant, yet the political reverberations lasted centuries. But here's where it gets truly twisted. Both Henry and Anne's deaths became public spectacles, just in different ways. Anne's execution drew crowds who watched a queen die with dignity, her composed final speech haunting witnesses. Henry's corpse became an unintentional horror show, his bloated body literally bursting its confines days after death. The king, who had Anne's head severed with surgical precision, couldn't control his own bodily decay. Charles II of Spain offers another grotesque comparison. While Henry's body exploded from within, Charles, product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding, was already falling apart while alive. His autopsy revealed a body so deformed that physicians described organs that barely functioned, a heart the size of a peppercorn, and intestinal systems that defied medical understanding. Henry ate himself into a diseased monster. Charles was born one. Medieval chroniclers documented these deaths with clinical fascination because they represented something deeper than individual tragedy. Edward II, murdered with a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum, died screaming so loudly that people heard him from outside Berkeley Castle's walls. His death was designed to leave no external marks while causing maximum agony, the perfect political murder disguised as natural death. The pattern becomes clear when you examine the evidence. Medieval power demanded physical dominance, so medieval death often targeted the body with surgical cruelty. Anne Boleyn's swift beheading, Edward II's internal burning, Henry's explosive decay. Each death reflected how these rulers had wielded power over others' bodies. What's truly horrifying is how these deaths were documented and remembered. Court physicians recorded every detail of royal autopsies, creating medical records that read like horror stories. They measured the decay, catalogued the deformities, documented the exact progression of death. These weren't just people dying. They were symbols of absolute power reduced to rotting flesh and surgical reports. Henry's bursting corpse wasn't an anomaly in royal death. It was the logical conclusion of a life spent consuming everything within reach. While Anne faced her executioner's sword with dignity intact, Henry couldn't even maintain bodily dignity in death. The king who controlled life and death for millions couldn't control his own decomposition, creating a legacy written in leaked bodily fluids and horrified courtiers' testimonies. Medieval royal death was never just personal tragedy. It was always political theater, whether planned like Anne's execution or accidental like Henry's posthumous explosion. But here's where Henry's corpse horror story reveals an even darker truth. The man whose body exploded in his own coffin had already perfected the art of destruction while he was alive, and nowhere was this more evident than in what happened to Anne Boleyn. Picture this: May 19th, 1536, Tower of London. A French swordsman specially imported for the occasion raises his blade. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had sparked Henry's break from Rome and changed English history forever, kneels blindfolded on the scaffold. One swift stroke and it's over. But here's what your history textbooks won't tell you about executions by sword versus the traditional axe. When a sharp blade severs the cervical vertebrae with sufficient force, the victim experiences rapid unconsciousness from traumatic brain injury. Death follows almost immediately once the spinal cord's control over breathing is disrupted. Henry chose the sword not out of mercy, but because he was obsessed with appearances. A clean execution looked better than the messy, often botched axe jobs that sometimes took multiple attempts. But wait, it gets worse. The charges against Anne were almost certainly fabricated. We're talking about accusations of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn. Modern historians have systematically dismantled these claims, revealing them as political maneuvers orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell to satisfy Henry's desperate need for a new wife and male heir. Think about the timeline here. In early 1536, Anne miscarried what was reportedly a male child. Within months, she was dead. The woman who had triggered the English Reformation, who had defied the Catholic Church and changed the course of European history, was destroyed the moment she failed to deliver what Henry demanded. Here's the truly insane part about Anne's legacy. Eyewitnesses like chronicler Edward Hall described how she remained composed and dignified right until the end. She delivered a speech forgiving those who condemned her and expressing loyalty to the king who was about to have her killed. Imagine having that kind of grace while facing execution for crimes you didn't commit. The myths surrounding Anne tell us everything about how history remembers women who challenged power. The six-finger legend, the witchcraft accusations, the narrative that she was a manipulative seductress who enchanted the king, all of it designed to justify what was essentially a royal murder. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing when you connect it to Henry's rotting corpse decades later. Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, would become one of England's greatest monarchs. The child of the woman Henry executed for failing to produce a male heir ended up ruling for 45 years and ushering in England's golden age. The same man whose body would eventually burst from decomposition had already demonstrated his talent for destruction while breathing. Anne Boleyn wasn't just another wife. She was the catalyst for religious revolution, the mother of a future queen, and ultimately the victim of a king whose obsession with male heirs would eventually see his own bloodline extinguished. Medieval palace records show that Anne's execution shocked even hardened court observers. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was a preview of the chaos that would follow Henry wherever he went, right up until his corpse created one final mess in his own coffin. What happened to Anne Boleyn proves that Henry's capacity for destruction didn't start with his death. It had been perfecting itself for 38 years of his reign. Within days of Henry's burial, whispers began spreading through the corridors of Windsor Castle like wildfire. The servants who had witnessed the horrific scene in the coffin couldn't stay silent forever, and soon stories of the exploded corpse were circulating among the nobility. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The Tudor court didn't try to suppress these stories, they weaponized them. Thomas Cranmer and the Protestant reformers saw an opportunity in Henry's grotesque death. They began quietly suggesting that perhaps God himself had passed judgment on the king who had executed so many, including 2 wives. The Catholic supporters, meanwhile, whispered that this was divine punishment for breaking with Rome. Both sides used Henry's rotting corpse as propaganda, turning his decomposed body into a political football that would be kicked around for centuries. The impact on royal burial practices was immediate and lasting. Future monarchs became obsessed with avoiding Henry's fate. Elizabeth I's courtiers were so traumatized by the stories of her father's burial that they implemented entirely new embalming techniques. When Elizabeth died in 1603, her body was so thoroughly preserved with spices, resins, and lead wrapping that it remained intact for decades. The royal family had learned that even in death, a monarch's body was a political statement. But the most devastating aftermath wasn't the gossip or the burial reforms. It was what happened to Henry's religious legacy. The man who had torn England apart to create his own church, who had dissolved monasteries and executed bishops, ended up decomposing in the very chapel he had stolen from the Catholic Church. Windsor's St. George's Chapel, where Henry rotted in his lead coffin, had been built with wealth seized from Catholic institutions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Within a generation, the stories had morphed into something far darker. By the 1570s, people were claiming that dogs had actually licked Henry's blood from the chapel floor, fulfilling biblical prophecy about wicked kings. Catholic pamphlets across Europe used Henry's putrefied corpse as evidence that Protestant Reformation led to literal and spiritual corruption. Protestant writers fired back, claiming Henry's decomposition proved that even royal flesh was equal before God. The psychological impact on the English people was profound. For decades, subjects had lived in terror of a king who could have you executed for a poorly worded joke. Now they learned that this terrifying monarch had ended up as nothing more than rotting meat and leaked fluids in a stone box. The divine right of kings suddenly seemed a lot less divine when your king exploded like an overstuffed sausage. Modern forensic experts who have studied the accounts believe the story contains enough medical accuracy to be largely true. The combination of Henry's obesity, his infected leg ulcers, and the primitive preservation methods of 1547 would have created perfect conditions for catastrophic decomposition. The gases produced by bacterial breakdown in an obese corpse can absolutely burst through lead seaming, especially when the body wasn't properly drained. Perhaps most telling is what happened to Henry's tomb. He had planned an elaborate monument that would have rivaled anything built for previous English kings. Instead, he got a simple stone slab that wasn't even installed until the 19th century. For over 250 years, the king who had terrorized England lay in an unmarked grave, remembered not for his power or his 6 wives, but for the disgusting mess his corpse had made on a winter night in 1547. Here's the thing about Henry VIII's death that nobody talks about in history class. It perfectly captured everything monstrous about the man himself. A king who spent his entire reign destroying lives, breaking faith, and literally tearing his kingdom apart died in the most fitting way possible. His own body turned against him, bursting open like the relationships he'd shattered and the church he'd split in two. You want to know why we're still obsessed with this story 5 centuries later? Because Henry's corpse, doing what amounted to a final act of rebellion against royal dignity, represents something deeply satisfying about justice. This was a man who had 6 wives, executed 2 of them, and traumatized an entire nation with his paranoid quest for male heirs. The fact that his body couldn't even stay contained in death feels like cosmic payback. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. The myths that grew around Henry's bursting corpse reveal more about us than about him. Medieval people already believed that evil souls corrupted the flesh, that wickedness would literally eat you from the inside out. When word spread that Henry's body had exploded in his coffin, it confirmed every supernatural fear his subjects had whispered about for decades. They saw divine punishment in his putrefaction, God's judgment made manifest in rotting flesh and burst seams. We've sanitized this story over the centuries, turning Henry into this almost cartoonish figure, the jolly fat king with his turkey legs and his many wives. But the reality of his death strips away that comfortable distance. This wasn't some larger-than-life monarch gracefully passing into legend. This was a diseased, paranoid, physically disgusting tyrant whose body was so corrupted by infection and excess that it couldn't even decompose with dignity. The most haunting part isn't the medical details, it's what happened after. Within hours of Henry's body bursting open, dogs reportedly found their way to the coffin and began feeding on the remains. If that's true, then the king who'd spent 40 years devouring everything around him, marriages, monasteries, entire belief systems, ended up being devoured himself by common strays. There's a poetry to that ending that no royal historian wanted to preserve in the official records. Think about Anne Boleyn, executed on a scaffold with grace and dignity, her final words forgiving the man who destroyed her life. Then picture Henry, alone in a sealed coffin, his corpse splitting apart from its own corruption while animals feast on what remained. Anne died maintaining her humanity. Henry lost his completely, even in death. What's survived isn't just the historical facts. It's this visceral understanding that ultimate power corrupts absolutely, right down to the cellular level. Every time someone mentions Henry VIII bursting in his coffin, they're really talking about what happens when unchecked authority meets human mortality. Kings can rewrite laws, restructure churches, and execute wives, but they can't escape the basic biology of decay. We keep telling this story because it reminds us that no amount of royal blood, divine right, or political power can save you from being fundamentally, disgustingly, completely human. Henry VIII wanted to be remembered as the great king who secured England's future. Instead, he's remembered as the monarch whose corpse couldn't even stay together long enough for a proper burial. That's not the legacy he planned, but it's exactly the legacy he earned.